Hello. The session that I propose today will be based on an article called Assessment for Learning Working Inside the Black Box. I would like to discuss today the different aspects of the formative assessment and different strategies that can be used in class to improve the process of assessment for learning. So this session is based on this article written by Black and William called Working Inside the Black Box, Assessment for Learning in a Classroom. It is an article that can be easily found on the internet and is very, very straightforward and gives extraordinary ideas on how to develop assessment for learning in the classroom. So basically, first of all, let's discuss what do we understand by formative assessment. And I think it's important that we all have the same understanding of what is it, when does it happen, what is its purpose. So basically, if we look at this cycle of assessment, I think it's a nice infographic, a nice mind map to show how formative assessment works. So we start by teaching. Basically, that's what we do on a daily basis, isn't it? And then while teaching, we collect evidence. This collection of evidence can be done in many ways. It can be by questioning, by looking at the students, by walking around while they're working, by individual talking with each one of them. And then based on that evidence that we collect during lesson, we analyze that evidence. We analyze it, we look at improvement, we look at development of skills, we look at understanding of content, knowledge, and so on. And then once we analyze this evidence, we give feedback to the students. However, this feedback that we give, and we're going to discuss about the different ways of giving feedback, it helps us not only for the students to improve their learning process, but it also helps us to adjust the teaching, see what went well, what can be improved in terms of teaching strategies, and then go back to teaching again, and the cycle starts back again. Of course, the summative assessment will be something that will happen once we analyze evidence by grading it. Yeah, so when we give a grade and we report on it, then automatically that becomes a summative assessment. So let's have a look at this cycle and let's discuss about these possibilities. The research on formative assessment says a couple of interesting things. The first one is that there is evidence that if we improve the way we assess formatively, the standards will automatically raise in class. But we need to make sure that formative assessment is meaningful, purposeful, and is used by the students in a correct way. Now, it's also proven that the traditional assessment methods don't promote good learning. So these typical assessments, when we talk about traditional assessment methods, we talk about pieces of work where students have to fill in gaps, or they have just to give raw, long answers or specific answers to concrete questions. This does not promote good learning. We also know that grading practices emphasize competition rather than personal improvement. So that could answer some of these questions that some people ask, and is that, should we grade or not formative assessment? I always say no. Why do I say no? Because of this third sentence. Because when we give a grade, when we convert an assessment into a summative task, then all of a sudden the students will focus on the grade and will not focus on the feedback. Because when we give a grade, this will create a feeling of competition amongst the students. We know that. Oh, what was your grade? I got that one, I got that one. This is unfair, this is fair. But this is not focusing on the personal improvement for each one of the students. And finally, depending on the feedback we give, looking at the feedback provided by many professionals, the feedback is mostly based on negative aspects of what was wrong, what were the reasons for you to have this particular grade. So let's reflect on that. Let's have a look at what can we do to make this formative assessment better. Yeah. So what we need to understand is that this assessment for learning has a couple of targets. The first one is to promote the students' learning, to promote the way in which they learn, to help them succeed, to help them shine, and for them to flourish in their experience in lessons. But we also need that this assessment for learning, we need to know that it provides information to us, teachers, but to the students as well. And this information provided by this assessment for learning, by formative tasks, can be used or should be used as a feedback for everybody to reflect, not only students, but also teachers. So I insist, the formative assessment is not only something that targets students' performance, it should also target teachers' performance. And the reflection should go both ways, from the students, from the teachers as well. So how can we change the way in which assessment happens? What can we do to improve this assessment for learning? So the article comes up with 4 headings. So I'm going to present these 4 headings, and then we're going to discuss for each one of them. The first one is in terms of questioning. So let's try to reflect on what we do, on our own experience. What happens when we ask a question to our students? Well, I'll be honest with you. Sometimes when I ask questions, I realize that I wait for less than a second because I need to cover certain content, because I need to rush, because I need to get to certain points, and the time is precious. So we wait for less than a second, and if there's no answer, what we do is we ask another question, or we answer the question ourselves. So basically, when we do these, I'm sure you agree with me, there's not learning going on. It's just teacher giving answers to questions. What can we do? What can we do when we question in class? Of course, the planning process is important. So that's why when we create units and we create a timeline of the units, we need to embed into those plannings the time given to correct questioning. So for example, we can ask questions and give 5 minutes for brainstorming in groups, for example, which would lead into group discussions, into collaboration activities. We can try to ask questions which are big questions, no specific questions that will allow students to think, reflect, bring content, bring knowledge from another subjects, have interdisciplinary links or transdisciplinary links, asking them to develop certain skills. So the way we ask questions, those questions must be worth asking. And those questions must be based on promoting thinking. And this thinking can be linked to another session that you can find in my YouTube channel, which is about visual thinking routines. So this is the change we can propose in terms of questioning. Make sure that we have time enough for students to reflect and allow them to work in collaboration. Doing it that way, we will also promote development of collaborative skills. Let's have a look at the second point from the article, which is the feedback through grading. Let's think, how do we assess our tasks? Do we give feedback on a numeric grade? We give a grade out of X points, depending on the system that we're teaching, and then we write a couple of sentences in the paper. If we do that, what happens is that students will focus on the number, and they will never look at the written feedback. So a numerical grade does not tell students how to improve their work. It just says, well, you got a 6 out of 8, you had a 9 out of 10, depending on the grade system you use, but that just tells them a fact. This is your situation now. But it doesn't tell them how to improve, how to do it better. So how can we change the way we give feedback? Yeah, probably the first thing we can do is mixing different types of tasks, written tasks, but also oral questioning. We can make sure that the feedback we give is based on aspects that were excellent, that were very good. Start always with a positive, and then after that write a couple of sentences with precise targets as a even better if. So what went well, even better if, this is one of the strategies that can be used to make sure that the comments that we give in our feedback, written in particular, oral, but written in particular, has a first start, which is the positive things as a student, what the student has done well, and what the next steps will be. What can he or she do to improve the grade? And I would like to add one thing in this point. The target is not always the top grade. The target for each student will be the next grade, depending on the one they just had. So when we give feedback, if we want this feedback to be meaningful, it should be achievable. So do never give feedback which is based on top grades. Give it as a next step. So the next step for you to improve now will be to do this. And of course, we need to give time for students to reflect after each lesson, at the beginning of the lesson, look at previous knowledge, check at the understanding, the engagement, the motivation. Ask them to reflect, how was it? What was your experience on that assessment? Maybe creating reflection tasks with specific questions that we want the students to reflect on, which can be skill-based, for example. The third point is about changing the way we assess. For example, who's in charge of assessing your students? Most of the time, we will realize that we are the ones in charge. So the assessment only comes one way and is only based on one perspective, which is the teacher's perspective. So what about changing the assessment process? What about using more self-assessment, more peer assessment? So this way, when the students put in place the assessment strategies, they will better understand the expectations. We need to have specific assessment criteria, and before the task, we must tell students, this is what I'm going to look at. These are the specific aspects that I'm going to look at in this task. And then, depending on the aspects that we're going to look at, we need to teach the skills that would allow the students to assess their own work. So if you put in place self-assessment strategies, we need to tell them first, okay, in order to be successful when assessing yourself or assessing your classmates, you need to make sure that you develop reflection skills, thinking skills, and all the skills that you will need to read that work or to listen to that presentation and then give your feedback. Then, of course, we'll go back to time. We need to give time to be dedicated to self-assessment and reflection. And we need to guide the students when they set targets. We need to make sure that the targets that they set for themselves or the ones that they set for their classmates are achievable. Because if not, then this feedback is not going to be useful. And we go back to my comment before, in order for that target to be achievable, it should be the next level, the next step. This is an example of a Project Zero Harvard visible thinking routine, and is the ladder of feedback. I think it's a very useful strategy to use in class in terms of self-assessment, of peer assessment. And what you do is you ask the students to give each other constructive feedback. In order for the feedback to be constructive, you want them to start from the bottom of this ladder and move up little by little. So you ask them first to ask questions to understand, to fully understand that task. So they might ask questions for themselves, or they might ask questions to their colleagues, but clarification questions. Then we want them to express what do they need, what are the examples they need to really understand that task, so the value. Yeah, and then you want them to state the concerns. So, but the way you present the concerns, it has to be in a positive way. For example, I wonder what would happen if you do this. It seems to me that this is what you wanted to do. Maybe you could have done it this way. What if what you presented, you've done it differently? So the feedback given in a positive way means helping the other person to reflect on what would have happened if it would have done differently, and then allow them to find out the solution by themselves. So a very important strategy, which I like, this ladder of feedback. And if you want to have more information, you have at the bottom of the slide the origin of it. Yeah, it's Project Zero from Harvard. And the last point of this article is the formative use of summative assessment. Let's try to clarify that. So when we give a summative task, theoretically by the end of every unit, what happens after? Probably, okay, we give a grade and we move on to the next unit, to the next topic. To what extent is that useful? When we move on, all the gaps from the past unit are still there. So how can we change the way we approach summative tasks to make it more formative? As we said before, peer marking, peer assessment, because by doing it, we can give feedback, but we also understand the process in which our classmate has done that activity. Then what about giving the students the possibility to formulate the rubrics? What about giving them the ownership of the task? Come up with a task and creating the assessment rubrics, depending on what they think they should achieve on that particular topic. Maybe trying to plan a reflective review of the work and then support your students in their self-management skills and help them to plan ahead and to plan the revision process or the note-taking activities using Cornell notes or using other strategies that you can use depending on your preferences. And finally, something very important is to teach skills that would allow students to develop their self-management. And as you realize, the word skills come up very often in all the sessions, because I cannot understand any formative assessment going on if it's not based on the development of skills for each one of our students. So all in one, a very interesting article, and I would like to just take these three findings from the article, which I found particularly interesting. The first one is that the priority in giving feedback is to challenge students, to make them think about the quality of their arguments, the quality of their work, reflect on what they've done and what can be done better, but always celebrating what they've done. Another one is to really have a look at the policies of our school and make sure that the policies reflect our assessment strategies. Most of the time what happens is that what teachers do in classroom, they do it in isolation. If this is written in the school policy, then at least we have a central point where everybody can go to make sure that the assessment practices across the school are the same ones, by year groups and by subjects. And finally, think when we give marks. When we give marks, what we're doing is telling the students to compare themselves with others, to compare themselves. Maybe we don't tell them, but that's what they do, basically. So try to move away from grading, unless it's a summative task, and propose, help them to improve, give them reasons, give them tools to improve their learning process and to reflect on it. Again, a very interesting article. I hope you found this session useful. Don't forget to write comments in the chat and see if we can have any sharing best practices going on. Thank you very much.